this is the frame that from an old hive where the bees have built it out with their beeswax. So all of this is really soft wax that they build. And you can see they're very particular about making each cell exactly the same size. And inside of those cells, the worker bees, so the worker bees make all of this wax, and then the queen will come along and she will lay her eggs, one in each cell. And they also use these cells to store their water and the nectar and the pollen from the flowers and trees. And the nectar that they put in here is clear. It almost looks like water when they gather it. So the worker bee flies out to a flower, let's say, gets some nectar, and flies back to the hive with the nectar. And she has two stomachs. One she uses for eating, and the other is called her honey tummy. And that is where she brings the nectar back from gathering it from the flowers, brings that nectar back in her honey tummy. And then when she gets back to the hive, she passes that nectar from her honey tummy back out to a worker bee in the hive, who then transports the nectar from her honey tummy into one of the cells. So it's the combination of the nectar and all the enzymes that are in that little honey tummy in the bee that combined end up making honey. So when the nectar first gets put in here, it looks almost like water. And the bees flap their little wings and keep it really, really hot in their hive, like 96 degrees in their hive year-round. And they get that extra water that's in the nectar to evaporate. And once it's evaporated enough that it becomes the consistency of honey, then they will put a capping on top of it to store it. And that's what they actually use for their winter. They work all summer long gathering their nectar to make honey to give them enough food to make it through the winter. And then they start all over again the next spring after they've eaten the honey that's in there, gathering more nectar and making honey for the following year. So the bees make their honey for themselves to eat. And so in a hive where I want to collect some of the honey for me, what I usually have are two of the deep supers filled both with frames, and that I leave for the bees over the winter. That has all of their honey in there and their whole hive in there so that they get to eat for the winter. But during the summer, once they've filled those up for themselves, I take another super, and it's called a shallow super, and put one of these on top of it with 10 more frames. Remember, these are their frames. So I put 10 more of these frames that are shallow also inside of there and put it on top, and then put the lid back on top of that. And you can have some hives with many, many, many supers on top. In order to extract the honey for what we want to keep in jars, the frame will have honey in all of the cells, and it'll be capped with another wax that the bees put over it. So you put your frames of honey down in this extractor, and the honey's pretty thick, so it won't just fall out. You can't just hold it there and let it drip out. Put it in the machine, close it up, and then you get the crank and you spin it around and around and around. The honey sprays out against the side of this big metal container and drips down. And at the bottom, on the outside of this big extractor, is a little hole with a little door that goes over it. So you can open up that door and the honey just flows out of that little door. The bees get established in their hive. They then will go out and look for their nectar and pollen. And they have a really interesting way of communicating with each other to tell each other when they come back to the hive where that nectar and pollen is so that the other bees can go and find it. And so one bee will go out, see that there's a flower or a tree in bloom with a bunch of flowers on it, and she'll come back and she does, it's called a little bee dance outside of the hive here. And she'll sit at the entrance and she'll turn in different circles at the entrance and she will shake her tail. Somehow through that communicate by which way she's turning and how many times she shakes her tail, which direction the bees are to go when they come out. Okay, so we're back at my house, and in my backyard I have 3 hives that are already established. So in the spring I need to start inspecting them. In the winter they hibernate, and they only come out on really nice days to kind of clean out the hive, but even then only a few come out. For the most part in the winter they just stay in there and they form a little ball clustered around the queen, and they flap their wings and produce enough heat in there by doing that to keep the hive at a nice about 96 degrees all winter long, and that keeps the queen warm and alive all winter. And so come springtime is when they start to then go out of their hive more to collect all of the nectar. So I'm using my hive tool to pry it apart because they've stuck it together. And you can see some bees on there, and you can see the burr comb from the wax that they've built up there. And so I just kind of stack things on top of each other as I'm inspecting. So what I'm looking for in here is, first of all, if they have enough room, but second of all, if the queen is laying eggs. And I have a hard time finding the queen in there. She's bigger than the others, so you can tell her apart, but not that much bigger that it's easy for me. So the best way to look for, to see if the queen is alive and well, is to look for her eggs. So I usually take a frame out of the center here, and I use my hive tool just to kind of pry it up. And again, it's really sticky, so it's hard to get up sometimes. And you can see that the queen, on this frame at least, has been in here recently. All of this brown capped is where she has laid an egg in each cell, and then the egg has grown into a larva, and then the worker bees seal it off, and the baby grows in there until she's ready to hatch out, and then she comes through there and they clean out the cell and get it ready for either to store food in there or for the queen to lay more eggs. Alright, so you can see in this frame how it's just filled with all nectar here. So this will be their stores of honey that they're going to eat later. And then some of the other frames have some pollen in it. And then if you go back even further, some other frames have the capped brood.